proud black Marine stands to witness his son's graduation, but as two guards try to force him out, an unexpected force rises. In a silent act of brotherhood and defiance, 6 Navy SEALs change the room forever. What happens next will leave you speechless. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the parking lot of Travis High School in Austin, Texas. But Marcus Bishop barely noticed the warmth on his skin. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, every step deliberate, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Dressed in his deep blue Marine Corps uniform medals, gleaming faintly in the morning light, he cut a striking figure among the throngs of families streaming into the auditorium. Yet it wasn't the crispness of his uniform or the deliberate shine of his boots that drew the glances. It was the sheer gravity in his presence, the quiet force in the way he moved. In his left hand, he carried a folded program for the graduation ceremony, and in his right, a small, worn photograph, edges frayed from years of being tucked into pockets and wallets. It showed his late wife, her smile bright, and her arms wrapped around a much younger Elijah, their son, who was now standing on the cusp of adulthood. Marcus pressed the photo briefly to his chest, his lips barely moving. "I promised you." He whispered into the air, the words swallowed by the rising murmur of the crowd. "I wouldn't miss this." He could have flown from Houston, but he'd chosen to drive. The Dodge Charger was his wife's favorite car, a tie to memories of laughter on weekend road trips. Her hands gripping the wheel as they navigated unfamiliar back roads. Even after her passing, that car felt like a thread stitching him back to her. So he drove through the quiet stretches of I-35 past rolling fields and sun-bleached towns, the hum of the road his only companion. His thoughts caught in the eddies of grief and pride. Inside the gymnasium, the air was thick with anticipation, the faint scent of floor wax and fresh flowers mingling with the quiet rustle of programs. Families filled the metal folding chairs, their chatter rising and falling like waves. Balloons bobbed gently near the ceiling banners, proclaiming "Class of 2025" stretched across the far wall. The principal adjusted her notes near the podium, while students in gowns clustered at the back, adjusting caps and whispering nervously. Marcus moved with purpose, the hush of his footsteps on the polished floor, like a silent drumbeat. He handed his ticket to a volunteer at the entrance, a young man with a clipboard, who glanced at the printout, nodded quickly, and pointed toward the reserved seating up front. "Family section, 3rd row from the stage," he said, his voice casual. "Thank you, Marcus," replied his voice steady, though his hands trembled ever so slightly as he pocketed the photo. He passed clusters of parents, their conversation softening as he approached a few offering polite nods or fleeting glances. Others stared their eyes, lingering just a moment too long before flicking away. Marcus wasn't new to these looks, the hesitation, the unspoken question, does he belong here? He sat in the 3rd row, his posture straight, the lines of his uniform unbroken, his hands resting on his knees. The chatter behind him faded into white noise. He focused on the stage, on the rows of students waiting to process in. Somewhere in that sea of eager, youthful faces was Elijah, his boy, now a young man stepping into the future. Marcus's heart swelled with something vast and unnamed, a mix of pride and longing of joy, tempered by the sharp ache of absence. His wife should have been here. She should have been the one fretting over the perfect seating, the one fussing with Elijah's gown, the one with tears already brimming. But it was just him now. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the music began, the opening chords of pomp and circumstance echoing against the gym's high ceiling. People stood shuffling awkwardly in the tight rows, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the students filing in. Marcus rose with them, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed and unblinking. The music filled the space, ceremonial and heavy with meaning. But in his ears, it blended with the faint hum of memory, the cadence of marching boots, the crackle of radio static in war zones, the echo of commands shouted against chaos. He felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable, a ripple of awareness that he wasn't alone in his solitary reverie. Eyes were turning, whispers brushing his ears. He caught the faintest tremor in the air behind him, the quickened breath of someone approaching. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The instinct to stand his ground was ingrained in his bones and every fiber of his being. "Excuse me, sir," a low voice murmured near his shoulder. Marcus turned his head, slowly meeting the gaze of a security guard in a black polo shirt, a radio clipped to his belt. His badge read Garrett. A second guard, taller and chewing gum, hovered just behind him. "This section's for family only." Garrett said, his tone measured, but with an undercurrent of authority. "I have my ticket," Marcus said, quietly, reaching into his jacket and producing the same printout he'd shown at the door. Third row family seating. Garrett barely glanced at it. "We've had a mix-up. You'll need to move to the back." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "My son is graduating today. I'm staying right here." The taller guard, Logan, shifted his stance, arms crossed. "It's not a big deal, sir. We're asking you nicely." The murmur in the gym swelled, whispers curling around the edges of the rows. A woman nearby leaned toward her companion, her eyes narrowing. A man 2 rows over discreetly raised his phone, angling the camera toward the interaction. Marcus exhaled slowly, his pulse steady despite the crackle of humiliation rising in his chest. "I'm not moving," he said, his voice low but resolute. Logan sucked his teeth, his eyes narrowing. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The air in the gym shifted again, the weight of unspoken tension thickening like fog. Marcus's grip on the program tightened, his knuckles white against the paper. Yet he remained seated, his back straight, his presence unyielding. Behind him, a ripple of movement, subtle like the first tremor before an earthquake. Heads turned. Attention once focused on the stage, and the students filing in now, anchored on the quiet standoff in the third row. Marcus Bishop sat alone, but not unseen. And though he spoke no more words, the silence he held was louder than any protest. It was a silence that would soon echo through the entire room, louder than any voice, stronger than any command. This was only the beginning. The hum of the packed gymnasium pulsed against Marcus Bishop's skin, a steady thrum of voices rising and falling around him like distant waves. Despite the heat and the crowd, he remained an island of stillness. His back was straight, his hands rested gently on his thighs, and his eyes, though unwaveringly fixed on the stage, missed nothing in his periphery. His uniform's crisp lines and gleaming insignia stood in quiet contrast to the colorful chaos of the graduation celebration. But that stillness was interrupted again. Garrett, the shorter security guard with the square jaw and forced professionalism, returned with Logan trailing behind him. Their footsteps were quiet but purposeful as they crossed the narrow aisle, stopping just short of Marcus's seat. He didn't need to turn to sense them. The tension in their presence cut through the air like a cold blade. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us," Garrett said. His voice lowered, but insistent, as though he were trying not to draw attention. The guard's eyes flicked sideways, catching the glances from nearby parents. Marcus turned slowly, his gaze calm but unyielding. "I've already explained," he said, his voice even. "I have my ticket. This is my assigned seat." Logan shifted uneasily, chewing his gum a little faster. "Look, we're just doing our job." "There's been a complaint." "A complaint," Marcus repeated softly. From whom Garrett's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he gestured subtly for Marcus to stand as if expecting silent compliance. The murmurs nearby swelled louder now. A few spectators leaned forward, their expressions flickering between curiosity and concern. Someone fumbled discreetly with a phone, angling it to capture the interaction. The attention, which had been on the graduating students moments before, was now shifting like a tide drawn irresistibly toward the quiet confrontation unfolding in the family section. Marcus exhaled, his voice measured. "I came here to see my son graduate. That's all I intend to do." Logan took a half step closer, his posture stiffening. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Marcus's hands tensed, not from fear, but from the strain of patience. His training years of it taught him restraint, taught him that composure in the face of confrontation was its own form of power. But inside, he felt a quiet ache, a raw sting that came from knowing exactly what this was. It wasn't about a complaint. It wasn't about a mix-up. It was about who he was. It was about the color of his skin, the assumptions packed tightly beneath every polite smile and measured request. It was about how, no matter his service or sacrifice, his presence in a space like this could still be questioned. Still, he remained seated, his voice steady. "You can speak to the principal if there's a problem." "But I'm not moving." The air thickened, the whispers swelling into a current that swept through the nearby rows. Garrett's hand twitched near his radio, his stance shifting into something just short of aggression. Logan's jaw tightened, but something in his eyes flickered. Hesitation, perhaps. A seed of uncertainty sprouting too late. Before either guard could speak again, a voice broke through the gathering hush. It was a woman's voice, firm but calm, coming from just behind Marcus. "Is there a reason you're asking him to leave?" the woman asked. She was dressed in a tailored blazer, her expression sharp with indignation. Her tone was not loud, but it carried slicing through the murmur like a blade. Garrett turned startled. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "On the contrary," she said, stepping closer, "when you single out a decorated Marine at his own son's graduation, without just cause, it concerns all of us." The whispers surged louder, now joined by a few murmured agreements from the crowd. A ripple of approval passed through the onlookers. Phones emerged more openly now, cameras trained on Garrett and Logan. The quiet confrontation was becoming a spectacle, one that neither of the guards had expected to escalate. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he remained silent, watching as the woman's words settled over the gathering like a protective shield. He recognized the shift, the slow but unmistakable tide of support that could not be undone by threats or gestures. Logan swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the entrance. Garrett's hand hovered near his radio again, but he hesitated, caught between procedure and the creeping realization that this moment was no longer under his control. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Garrett said, his voice thinning. "Please come with us." Before Marcus could reply, another voice joined the chorus, deep, resonant, calm, yet commanding. From several rows back, a man stood, his stance relaxed, but his presence unmistakable. His voice was low, carrying over the room without effort. "Leave the man alone." The room fell almost silent. The man's words were not shouted, but they cut deeper than any raised voice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that radiated strength. His eyes met Garrett's with the steady weight of a man who had seen enough to know when a line was crossed. The two guards hesitated. Garrett's shoulders tensed, but he took a half-step back, as if physically withdrawing from the confrontation. Logan's gum stopped moving altogether. The tension in the air seemed to crackle, an invisible current arcing from the standing man to the guards, to Marcus, and then to the gathering witnesses. Marcus recognized the man without needing a name. He had seen that posture, that quiet readiness, in places far removed from the safety of a suburban gymnasium. It was the look of someone who didn't just stand for something, but who would stand for someone. It was a brotherhood forged not in words, but in actions, in sacrifice, in the silent understanding of what it meant to protect. And the guards, though they might not have known it yet, were about to understand too. As the crowd's murmurs turned into a hushed but tangible support, Marcus felt a shift within himself, not a surge of relief, but a quiet affirmation that he wasn't alone. The challenge wasn't over. But now, as more voices stirred around him, he realized that this battle fought with patience and dignity was not his alone to bear. Others were stepping forward silent yet immovable to ensure that this injustice would not be allowed to stand. Marcus Bishop remained seated, feeling the weight of every eye upon him, as the two guards hesitated, caught between their dwindling authority and the invisible shift of the crowd's mood. The woman's voice had sparked a fuse, but it was the standing figure, several rows back, a quiet but unmistakable force that had ignited something deeper. As Marcus sat in his chair, his mind drifted for a fraction of a second to the countless times he had stood at attention, the steady weight of duty on his shoulders. But this was different. This wasn't about medals or uniforms. It was about something far more personal. A murmur rippled through the audience as another man stood not next to the first, but across the gym near the far corner. His posture was calm, hands clasped loosely in front of him, but the set of his jaw spoke volumes. Marcus knew the look. He had seen it on tarmacs, and in the hush of briefing rooms, in the moments before a mission, when words were unnecessary. It was a look of silent commitment, the kind that only comes from men who understand the stakes. A third figure rose, this one near the bleachers, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding. Without a word, he locked eyes with Marcus and gave the slightest nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that transcended the confusion and posturing of the guards. This wasn't chaos. It was something far more powerful, a silent declaration of allegiance. Garrett's jaw tightened. He glanced nervously around the room, perhaps calculating that their authority was slipping, trying to measure the weight of the room's shifting allegiance. His hand hovered near his radio, but he didn't reach for it. The moment to assert control had passed, and he knew it. Logan shifted uncomfortably, his gum forgotten, his shoulders slumping slightly. He seemed younger now, his earlier bravado dimmed by the gravity of the scene unfolding around him. He looked at Garrett, waiting for a cue, but Garrett offered none. Instead, Garrett's eyes flickered uneasily toward the growing circle of standing men, sensing but not yet fully comprehending the depth of what was happening. Marcus's heart thrummed, not from fear, but from a deep welling emotion, a mixture of gratitude and fierce resolve. These men rising silently were not here for spectacle. They weren't drawing attention for themselves. They were here for him, for what he represented. They were here to remind everyone, including Garrett and Logan, that some bonds cannot be broken, no matter how subtle the discrimination or how quiet the injustice. The crowd's murmur grew into a hum, a low, resonant wave that filled the gymnasium. Parents and families who had been engrossed in the ceremony moments ago were now leaning forward, their expressions ranging from curiosity to dawning comprehension. Phones appeared raised discreetly, but deliberately, capturing not just the confrontation, but the quiet solidarity swelling in its wake. A woman near Marcus's row whispered, "They know him. They're standing up for him." Her words carried not just awe, but a note of realization that this was no ordinary disagreement. This was something larger, something far more consequential. Then, as though the room itself had taken a breath, a fourth man stood, followed by a fifth. His expression calm, his gaze steady. They were spread across the gym, unconnected in appearance, but unmistakably unified in purpose. Their rising wasn't choreographed, wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniably powerful. It was the kind of quiet, determined stand that made people sit up and pay attention. Marcus felt his throat tighten, a raw swell of emotion catching him off guard. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize him or to stand in his defense. But as these men, his brothers, in arms rose one by one, he realized that the bonds formed in fire, and dust didn't end when the mission did. They endured, woven into the very fabric of who they were. Garrett took an uncertain step back, the earlier edge in his voice evaporating into the charged silence. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, but it was more to himself than anyone else. "No," came a calm voice from behind, a voice Marcus recognized immediately. It was Jason Red, a man who had once pulled Marcus from the wreckage of an overturned vehicle, his steady hands saving Marcus's life under enemy fire. Jason now stood in the aisle, his posture relaxed, but his voice carrying undeniable authority. "What's out of hand is you trying to move a man who has every right to be here." The gym seemed to hold its breath. Even the school officials, who had been murmuring nervously at the front, were now watching their hesitancy dissolving into wide-eyed recognition of the situation spiraling beyond their control. Marcus's pulse steadied. His mind, so practiced in assessing threats and formulating plans, now settled to a quiet confidence. He met Jason's gaze, a silent message passing between them. This ends now, with dignity intact. Jason's voice, though still low, carried across the room. "We're not here to disrupt. We're here to witness a young man graduate, so let's let that happen." Garrett's face flushed red, his lips thinning as though he wanted to argue, but he found no words. Logan looked at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. Then, without further protest, Garrett stepped back, lowering his radio, his stance loosening. He glanced around as if searching for an escape, but the collective gaze of the room, the quiet, resolute presence of Marcus's silent defenders, left him no easy exit. Marcus inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. The storm was passing, but its impact was undeniable. As Jason stepped back into the crowd, as the standing men returned quietly to their seats, a hush settled over the gym. Not of fear, but of respect. The balance had shifted. The weight of quiet authority had prevailed over whispered prejudice. And for the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself the smallest of smiles. It wasn't one of triumph, but of acknowledgement of the strength found not in confrontation, but in unity, and the unspoken power of standing together in the face of injustice. The ceremony pressed on, but the air in the gym had shifted. The students on the stage readjusted their robes, trying to focus on the moment, but their eyes drifted again and again to where Marcus Bishop sat. Even those seated in the bleachers sensed the weight of what had just transpired, the silent solidarity, the way the crowd had collectively leaned into a truth that transcended school protocols and rigid lines of authority. It wasn't just about a reserved seat or a misunderstanding anymore. It was about what that seat represented. It was about dignity. Marcus remained seated, hands resting lightly on his knees, his breathing steady. His focus was no longer on Garrett or Logan, nor on the murmurs that still rippled through the audience. His gaze was now locked on the stage, on the row of students in caps and gowns. Near the center stood Eli Bishop, his son, his eyes darting anxiously toward his father before darting back to his classmates. Marcus could feel the silent question in Eli's glance. "Are you okay? Are you still here?" The answer was simple. "Yes, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The principal's voice echoed over the microphone, her words steady, but with a noticeable catch in her throat. She resumed calling names, her voice weaving through the applause that followed each student's walk across the stage. Yet the applause seemed different now. It wasn't simply polite or perfunctory. It was layered with a kind of quiet reverence, a recognition of something larger that had just played out before them. Marcus's mind flicked back to the moment Garrett's hand had hovered near his radio, the tension poised to snap. He recalled the surge of silent defenders rising from the crowd, the gravity in their eyes. They hadn't said a word yet. Their presence had carried more weight than any argument, more impact than any confrontation. The audience had seen it too, and now, as each name was called, the gym seemed to hum with a newfound understanding. Eli's name came closer. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he didn't shift in his seat. He stayed rooted, determined to meet his son's moment with calm, unwavering strength. Around him, whispers continued, some recounting the earlier confrontation, others simply exchanging glances of quiet respect. A woman near the aisle murmured to her neighbor, "That's his boy up there. Can you imagine what that must mean to him now?" When the principal finally called Eli Bishop, the name seemed to resonate beyond the microphone, beyond the folding chairs and concrete bleachers. The room fell momentarily still before erupting into applause, not the scattered clapping that had accompanied other names, but a unified, deliberate wave of appreciation. It wasn't just for Eli's achievement. It was for Marcus's quiet dignity, for the stand that had been taken without words, for the recognition that this moment was about more than just a diploma. Eli stepped onto the stage, his shoulders squared, his walk deliberate and sure. He accepted his diploma from the principal with a firm handshake and turned to face the crowd. His eyes scanned, searching until they found his father. Their gazes locked, and for an instant, the noise of the gym faded into silence. There was no need for a wave or a gesture. The connection between them was complete, a silent conversation of pride, love, and unspoken understanding. Marcus allowed himself the smallest smile, a barely perceptible upward tilt of his lips. It was enough. Eli saw it and nodded, once his own smile breaking through the tension on his face. He stepped off the stage and joined the line of graduates, but the applause continued a beat longer, as though the audience wasn't quite ready to let go of the moment. The principal cleared her throat, attempting to regain the ceremony's rhythm. But something had shifted permanently. Each student who crossed the stage afterward did so in the echo of that recognition, as though the applause for Eli had imprinted a deeper awareness into the proceedings. Parents clapped more earnestly. Teachers nodded with a bit more pride. The room carried an undercurrent of solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson that had just been learned. As the ceremony drew to a close and the final names were called, Marcus rose slowly from his seat, careful to let the applause fade before he moved. He stretched his legs, his posture still composed, his steps unhurried. The people nearest him stepped aside, some offering small nods of respect, others murmuring quiet words of congratulations. He responded with a simple, steady gaze, grateful, but not needing to speak. The gym emptied gradually, the buzz of conversation rising as families reconnected with their graduates. Eli found his way through the crowd, his cap slightly askew, his diploma folder clutched in his hand. When he reached his father, he didn't hesitate. He stepped in and embraced him tightly, the gesture natural and unforced. I saw everything, Eli said quietly, his voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. I wanted to say something, but you didn't need me to. You handled it. Marcus pulled back just enough to meet his son's eyes. You stood tall today, Eli, and you'll remember that more than anything. They didn't need more words. The moment itself, heavy with recognition and solidarity, was enough. As the last of the crowd filed out of the gym, the Bishop men stood together, a quiet beacon of resilience amid the departing chaos. The ceremony might have ended, but for Marcus and Eli, the real graduation, the passage from silence to recognition, had just begun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot of Travis High, Marcus and Eli Bishop lingered near the old Dodge Charger. The ceremony was over. The applause had faded, but the weight of what had happened inside the gym still lingered in the cool evening air. Eli's cap hung loosely in his hand, the edges creased from the tight grip he had kept on it since crossing the stage. Marcus leaned against the car, his posture as steady as it had been when he first entered the gym. But now it carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who had held his ground and carried the weight of history on his shoulders. They stood in silence for a while, letting the hum of conversation and the shuffle of families packing up fade into the distance. A few of the SEALs lingered too, not in a show of force, but as silent sentinels, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of solidarity. They spoke in low tones, their laughter subdued, respectful of the moment. Marcus caught their eyes, offering a subtle nod of thanks that said more than words ever could. One by one, the men departed, each gesture unspoken but deeply felt. Eli finally broke the silence. Dad, how did you stay so calm? I mean, they were pushing you, trying to make you leave. I would have lost it. Marcus looked down at his son, the fading light catching the lines of his face, etched by years of disciplined service and quiet resilience. Eli, sometimes strength isn't about being loud. It's about knowing when silence speaks louder than words. They were trying to provoke me, trying to make me react. But I knew that if I stood still, if I stayed calm, they'd show themselves for who they were. And they did. Eli chewed on his lower lip, nodding slowly. I saw how everyone watched. I saw how they started to realize. Marcus's voice, softened, laced with quiet pride. You saw the shift, didn't you? When the truth became undeniable, when their actions couldn't be ignored, it wasn't just about me sitting in that chair. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, who's been asked to leave, to step aside, to disappear. Today, we didn't disappear. We stood, and others stood with us. Eli's gaze dropped to his diploma, his fingers tracing the embossed lettering. I want to be like that, like you. Someone who doesn't back down, but doesn't have to shout to be heard. You're already on your way, Marcus said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Today wasn't just about you crossing the stage. It was about understanding that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And sometimes it's claimed in the smallest moments, like standing your ground when no one expects you to. The car's engine rumbled to life as Marcus turned the key, the familiar sound grounding them both. Eli slid into the passenger seat, glancing back once at the now empty gym. What happens next? He asked, his voice low. Marcus let out a slow breath, his eyes on the road ahead. Next we live. We take this moment and let it remind us of who we are, of what we stand for. We carry it forward, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who couldn't speak up today. And when the time comes again, and it will come again, we stand. As the Charger pulled away from the school, the fading sun painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. They didn't speak for a while, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt, filling the silence between them. But there was no need for words. They both understood. Beyond the ceremony, beyond the applause, and the tension, beyond the quiet victory of standing firm in the face of injustice, there was a deeper lesson, a lesson that would echo through their lives and the lives of others. That day wasn't just a graduation, it was a beginning, a reminder that courage, dignity, and solidarity aren't just acts for the moment, they're a way of life. And as Marcus and Eli drove into the evening, the road stretched out ahead of them, not just as a path home, but as a path forward. A path where silence could be powerful, where standing firm could change the world, and where the quiet strength of one could ignite the courage of many. Marcus Bishop's story wasn't just about a father witnessing his son's graduation. It was a tale of resilience, dignity, and the quiet, unwavering power of standing one's ground. What should have been a simple, joyful milestone was nearly overshadowed by the heavy weight of prejudice. Marcus, a Black Marine, had driven across Texas not just to see his son Eli graduate from high school, but to keep a promise to be there no matter what. And in doing so, he found himself caught in a moment that tested everything he stood for. Two guards, blind to the quiet strength of the man before them, tried to diminish him, tried to strip him of his place at his son's side. But what they didn't count on was the silent, steadfast resolve of Marcus and the 6 Navy SEALs who rose in solidarity without a word. In the face of subtle hostility and overt disrespect, Marcus did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His stillness was his protest, his dignity, his armor. The quiet recognition of injustice was met not with shouts, but with the unshakable presence of men who knew what true loyalty meant. They had faced gunfire together, survived battles that left scars, both seen and unseen, and they knew instinctively when to stand not for glory, but for each other. In that high school gym, surrounded by banners and folding chairs, their silent stand spoke louder than any protest. They reminded everyone watching that respect is not granted based on appearance or assumptions. It's earned through actions, through loyalty, and through quiet courage. Eli's journey across the stage became more than a personal achievement. It transformed into a powerful symbol of how dignity can stand tall even in the face of ignorance. Marcus's story reminds us all that sometimes the most profound statements come not from shouting or confrontation, but from composure, from knowing who you are and refusing to let others define you. It teaches us that standing up doesn't always mean being loud. It can mean standing still, grounded in truth and integrity, even when the world around you tries to push you aside. In today's world, where moments of prejudice and injustice still unfold around us, Marcus's story is a blueprint for how to respond with dignity, solidarity, and unwavering strength. It challenges us to recognize injustice when we see it, and to stand even if in silence alongside those who are targeted. It reminds us that we each have a role to play, whether by speaking up, standing beside someone, or simply refusing to be complicit in silence. True strength isn't about overpowering, it's about empowering. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of standing up for what's right, then join us in building a community that amplifies these stories of resilience. Subscribe to our channel, share this story with others, and let's keep this conversation alive. Together, we can shine a light on truth, dignity, and justice, and ensure that these lessons ripple outward to inspire a more compassionate, courageous world. Let's make sure stories like Marcus's are never forgotten. Stay tuned for more and be part of this movement for change.